Welcome to Building Control, navigating the impact of regulatory changes on the wider UK sector, which is sponsored by Premier Guarantee and is part of our two-day programme on risk and regulations. I am Thomas Lane, the Group Technical Editor of Building Magazine. Building control professionals play a critical role in ensuring the safety and quality of our built environment. From April 2024, building control professionals will be regulated by the Building Safety Regulator to raise industry standards and increase public trust. That date, by the way, has changed to July now, but we'll be discussing that in the session. The competence regulations will require a requirement for building control professionals to register with the Building Safety Regulator. In this session, we will explore the changes to building control regulations and the implications for building control officers and those engaged in designing and delivering buildings. To discuss this, I'm joined by four experts. Gerard Cooper, who is the Head of Building Control Professional Standards at the Building Safety Regulator. Paul Jolly, the Technical Director of Risk Mitigation and Dispute Resolution Consultancy, HKA. Andy Mullins, the Head of Quality at Hill, a house builder, and is also on the Building Advisory Committee, which advises the Building Safety Regulator on building standards and safety. And Natalia Thomas Alvarez, the Director of Building Control, Premier Guarantee, an improved inspector, or actually what we call now a building control approver and a new parlance. So the format of the session is each panelist will present for about 10 minutes. And then once the four formal presentations are over, we will take questions from the audience. And you can submit your questions online and we will endeavour to answer as many of these as possible. So what our speakers will talk about, Gerard will explain how the Building Safety Regulator will regulate the building control profession. Paul will cover the role and responsibilities of the principal designer. Andy will talk about the challenges of complying with the new regulatory regime from the developer perspective. And finally, Natalia will cover the challenges of meeting the new competence requirements and the implications for building control services. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to our first speaker, Gerard Cooper from the Building Safety Regulator. Over to you, Gerard.
Yes, hello. I will just share my screen. Bear with me, this is a slightly different setup than I'm used to, so just bear with me a second. I'll just put that on the slideshow. So hello and welcome. So I'm Jed Cooper. I'm Head of Building Control Professional Standards at the Building Safety Regulator. My responsibilities include local authority building control functions, registered building control approvers, and registered building inspectors. So my role is to lead the operational delivery of the function within the BSR that regulates the building control profession. I'll just get rid of that box. Okay, so we will provide encouragement, support and advice, and where appropriate, implement enforcement and sanctions. The team also manage the registration of the building control approvers and RBI's application process. So as you can see from this graphic, the BSR is a very wide remit. I'm focusing today on the regulation of the building control profession, and I've put a bit of a black ring around my section, but you can see it's a very wide remit and we're just not going to get through everything in 10 minutes. So I won't try and cover everything. So the industry, working with industry and BSR. So we're on a challenging yet rewarding journey together. We're all tasked with improving the standards of safety of our built environment. It's a demanding challenge, but one I firmly believe that we can achieve. So BSR has worked with building control and the wider industry. We've developed professional codes and standards which set out minimum expectations of building control professionals and their employers. It includes, for example, the registration conditions and the code of conduct for inspectors. I mean, you can find out more online, but we'll cover some more of those in detail as we move forward in this short presentation. Okay. So it's important to emphasise that although the BSR came about as a result of the Grenfell Tower tragedy, there are key features of the BSR's work that cover all buildings, and the arrangements which I'm going to talk to you about are for building control professionals working on all buildings, so not just HRBs. So I'm going to focus on today on the regulation of the profession. So for individuals who are the building inspectors, we've got they will be known, or they're going to be known, and as I'm sure you're aware, as building inspectors, registered building inspectors. They will have to register to operate as a building inspector, and that process is underway at the moment. And that will enable them to carry out the restrictive functions and activities that's necessary for the building control process. They'll have to meet competence requirements, and that's set out in a framework I'll just explain in a moment. For the private sector building control bodies, these are registered building control approvers from 6th of April. They'll register, all in the process of registering at the moment with the building safety regulator. There's a set of criteria and conditions that they have to meet, and they are in the process of demonstrating that at the moment. They'll all be bound by professional conduct rules. It's not completely dissimilar to the current arrangement for the private sector. So, and there are common rules between the public and private sector. For local authority building control, they don't need to register with the BSR. They need to meet the same performance standards in the operational standard rules as the private sector. So, okay, I'll just move on. I just need to cut out some of this so we can get through this in time. So, for the building inspectors, there are 4 classes. Okay, so class 1 can't carry out restricted activity. It's really an introductory class. However, there is a temporary grace period for existing professionals who are awaiting to complete their competence assessment, and those who haven't failed an assessment twice. And this is a temporary permission just to allow the professionals who are in the process to complete their applications. And that will end on the 6th of July. So after the 6th of July, class 1 will revert to being what it was designed for, which is just an introductory class into the profession. Class 2 and 3 are the building control professionals. Class 2 covers most building work in England and Wales, and class 3 focuses on the more complex and HRB work. Class 4, to be a class 4, they have to be a class 2 or 3, and that is a management role, which is introduction at the moment. It's not compulsory at all. It's part of the future plan, the future development of the building inspector competency framework, otherwise known as the BICOF. Okay. And the BICOF itself, it sets out a number of themes for professionals to demonstrate their competence. There are 3 assessment schemes at the moment, all covering the same areas, all demonstrating the competence, but all in different ways. For example, some will have a test, and some will have an interview. All will involve presenting a portfolio of evidence. Okay, and so registration. I'll just key point on that is that they will have to register every 4 years an individual, and registered building control approvers will re-register every 5 years. Okay. So we've got some timelines on there, which, as I mentioned earlier, and I mentioned earlier in my presentation, that the timeline has been pushed back in terms of competency until July. However, the requirement to register and sign up to a code of conduct and be accountable to the building safety regulator starts for all the registered builders registered building inspectors on the 6th of April. Okay, so that's and just a heads up on that, we're receiving a significant increase in applications, and information we've got appears at this stage to look like we will have enough inspectors registered to carry on with the function as we all want to. Okay, so it's quite a big slide there. I'm going to run out of time at the moment, but I think the key thing there is that the building safety regulator is working with industry, is listening, is responding. It will provide encouragement and support, and everyone in the profession has a role to play to deliver these changes. Okay, so that's the end of my slide. I'll hand back now to the team.
Great. Thanks very much, Gerard. That was great. And before I move on to our next speaker, I'm getting a lot of queries actually from our audience already. It's unusual at this stage of a webinar, and they're all asking the same thing. How many building safety accreditations have you handed out so far?
So when you say building safety accreditations, do you mean registered building inspectors?
Yeah, registered. I mean, and they're deemed to be competent, presumably, once they're registered.
No, it's with the problem. So we think there's about 4,500 building inspectors operating, and that nobody's ever captured that information before. That information isn't actually definitive. We just don't know. But we made an estimate with the industry that's about 4,500. Yesterday, there's about 3,500 registered or started the registration process with the building safety regulator. So a key part of that registration process is that they have to demonstrate their competence, and that's where there's a bit of a bottleneck at the moment. So that's we'll give them more time to work their way through that system. So the actual registration process for an inspector with the building safety regulator is a very painless process. The challenge for them is proving the competency, and they do that through a competence assessment scheme, and there's 3 of those schemes available. So that's it. We're also assessing the applications for registration for registered building control approvers, and that's going very well. But because of they're in active at the moment, we won't be able to make a formal decision on those applications until next week, until after the 1st of April, when SICA end, and we will during that week we should be able to get the notifications out to people that they've been approved. Right. Okay, so that's a really positive move on the approved inspector side, who will become registered building control approvers.
Sure. And I mean, out of interest, you've got the class 2 and the class 3. Yeah. How many people are applying? What sort of proportion, I should say, are applying for class 3? That's the ability to regulate high-risk buildings, high-rise risk buildings.
Okay, so I've not done a detailed analysis at the moment. Mm-hmm. We're still waiting. We get weekly updates from the scheme providers. There's a team of people who are looking at that at the moment. Obviously, most of the work is class 2 in the UK, in England and Wales. Sorry, it's class 2. So class 3 is actually above 18 meters and complex and HRBs. There's much less required in terms of volume for those applications, and that's what we're seeing. We're seeing much less volume of people coming through at class 3.
Right. Great, that's really interesting. Thanks very much, Gerard. So let's move on to our next presentation, and that is Paul Jolly is going to talk about the principal designer role. So over to you, Paul.
Thanks very much, Thomas. I'll just share my screen. Hopefully that's come up for everybody. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to give this presentation today. I'm a chartered architect with HKA, technical director, and I'll be discussing the roles and responsibilities of the new principal designer duty holder. So the subject of building safety reforms has obviously been under intense scrutiny since the fire at Grenfell Tower in 2017. We've seen some significant changes to the building regulations and approved document B. And we've obviously seen the arrival of the Building Safety Act in 2022. And more recently, there's been some significant secondary legislation which sets out the new duty holder regime and the procedures for higher risk buildings, or HRBs. So there's only so much that we can attempt to cover today in the short presentation, but this introduction shows the range of topics that I'll be discussing. So as I'm sure you're all aware, the Building Safety Act was introduced following the government's independent review of building regulations and fire safety that was led by Dame Judith Hackett. And one of the key criticisms that came out of that review was the lack of clarity on the roles and responsibilities between the parties who procure, design and construct buildings, where it was felt there needed to be a more robust ownership of accountability. So this is why the new duty holder framework was established, and Judith Hackett's recommendation was to adopt the same duty holder titles that's currently used under CDM 2015, which includes that of the principal designer and also the principal contractor. And the idea was to avoid unnecessary confusion in adopting the same titles. So the CDM regulations, just going back, are secondary legislation made under the Health and Safety at Work Act. And some of you may know that Judith Hackett was chair of the HSE for 8 years, but, and she oversaw the reforms that led to the introduction of the principal designer role under CDM 2015. And the principal designer replaced the previous role of the CDM coordinator under the 2007 regs. Which up until that point, that role was mainly being taken on by peripheral health and safety consultants. And one of the key drivers for the title change and the introduction of the word designer into the duty holder title was to place matters relating to health and safety at the heart of the design process. And as it says on the slide, the primary role of the CDM principal designer is that they must plan, manage, and monitor the pre-construction phase of a project and to coordinate matters relating to health and safety. And the HSE felt that the lead designer on a project, which would typically be an architect, was best placed to perform this role, given they were most likely to be the party in control of the design phase prior to construction. So bringing us a little more up to date with key developments over the last 6 months, there were 2 significant pieces of secondary legislation that came into force on the 1st of October last year. These are the 2023 amendments to the building regulations and the procedures for higher risk buildings, or HRBs. So anyone involved in the design of buildings should familiarise themselves with this legislation, as it sets out the duties for all designers under the building regulations, in addition to those of the principal designer. And the key point really to make here is that a principal designer is now required on all projects that are subject to building regulations approvals, regardless of scale. And as has been the case with CDM, in instances where a domestic client fails to appoint a principal designer, the designer in control of the design phase, which is most likely to be an architect on a residential project, will automatically assume the principal designer role. And there are more onerous responsibilities and tougher sanctions when working on HRBs, which I'll touch on shortly. So under the building regulation amendments, the core duty of the principal designer is to coordinate matters relating to the design work comprised in the project, so that all reasonable steps are taken to ensure that if the building work to which that design relates were built in accordance with that design, the building work would be in compliance with all relevant requirements. And these relevant requirements are defined in the legislation, and they include the requirements listed in Schedule 1 to the Building Regulations 2010, which runs from Part A structure all the way through to Part S, concerning the charging of electric vehicles. And the requirements also include Regulation 7, which governs materials and workmanship. So, in other words, the principal designer must take all reasonable steps to ensure that the design work on a project is coordinated to demonstrate compliance with the building regulations. And it's important to note that this is not just design relating to fire or building safety. It's all elements of design that need to be coordinated as required to address the functional requirements set out in Schedule 1, which are shown on the right-hand side. So although individual designers remain responsible for the compliance of their own designs, as has always been the case under building regulations for the last 40 years, the principal designer now has overall responsibility for coordinating those designs. So moving on to HRBs, this is defined by the diagram on the left-hand side of the slide. They're buildings that have at least 2 residential units, and they're either at least 18 meters tall or they have at least 7 stories. And this definition also applies to care homes and hospitals. And when working on an HRB project, the principal designer needs to provide a competence declaration as part of an HRB building control application to the building safety regulator. They also need to establish a system for mandatory occurrence reporting for parties working on the projects to raise any safety concerns with both the principal designer and the principal contractor. They must also ensure that there's an appropriate frequency of inspections undertaken throughout the construction phase for safety occurrences. And these are defined as critical aspects of the design that, if built incorrectly, would be likely to present significant risks to death or serious injury. And at completion, they're required to provide a signed compliance declaration stating that they have fulfilled their statutory duties as a principal designer. And the other significant factor, of course, impacting on design coordination with HRBs is the new gateway regime, which is required on all HRB projects. And the key requirement is that the design work needs to be approved by the building safety regulator at Gateway 2 prior to commencing construction. So this will obviously have a major impact on how these projects are designed and procured, particularly in respect of design and build. And the building safety regulator's 12-week determination period, as well as the new change control regime, will also need to be factored into design programs. So in addition to providing clearer accountability and enhanced duties for designers, one of the core objectives of the Building Safety Act, as we've already touched on, is the need to establish competency requirements and to ensure that these high standards are set and maintained. So there are publications available providing further guidance on how to demonstrate these requirements have been met, including the BSI Flex publication shown here, which, as the name suggests, is a code of practice intended to be flexible to keep a pace of fast-changing legislation, and that document's already on its 3rd revision. And there's also the PAS 8671 publicly available specification document, which is a framework specifically aimed at demonstrating the core competency requirements of the principal designer role. So just moving on to my final slide. The RIBA's position is that architects now need to step up to this challenge. They've published a brand new guide last month, which covers the requirements for both the CDM and the building regulations duty holder for the principal designer. And they also now have a principal designer register for members with 2 levels of certification. There's a general competency level and a higher level for those working on HRB projects. But it remains to be seen whether architects will be prepared to take on this new role with increased liabilities and tougher sanctions. and there was a report that was commissioned last year by the HSE, which looked at the implementation of the CDM principal designer role. And they found that in general, architects were still reluctant to take on the role of the principal designer, as they saw CDM health and safety matters as being more the contractor's responsibility. So just to conclude with a question really, is that if the architectural profession remains reluctant to take on these additional duties to lead the design process, who else will? Thank you very much. That's the end of my presentation.
Great, thanks very much indeed, Paul, for that. And just to clarify, I wasn't quite, maybe I misheard you, but if on maybe on a smaller project, if no one is appointed as a principal designer, but I wasn't right in thinking you're saying that that falls to the architect by default, that you can't presumably have a job where there's no principal designer at all.
Yeah, I mean it's presumably if that project does involve an architect, it will essentially it will fall to the designer who is in control of the pre-construction phase. So yeah, that's been the case with CDM as well. So in the case where there is no specific appointment that identifies the principal designer, the legislation is written that that would occur by default.
So architects, almost to answer your question, so if architects are reluctant to take on the role, they're going to be assigned it by default by the sound of it, unless someone else steps up.
Yeah, I mean, I think that would certainly be the case for the small scale domestic projects, but it's questionable whether on some of the larger, particularly the HRB projects, obviously that wouldn't be something that would be assigned by default. That would need to be appointed. So
sure, great. Well, thanks very much, Paul. Very, very interesting. So we'll move on now to Andy Mullins from the House Builder Hill, who's going to talk about the developer perspective. So over to you, Andy.
Thanks very much, Thomas. Right, who am I? Well, I'm Andy Mullins, as the clue's in the title. I'm the Group Head of Quality at Hill. Been at Hill about 3.5 years. I was formerly 11 years at NHBC, where I was Head of Inspection, and then headed up their major projects team. And as was mentioned in the intro at the start, I am a member of the Building Advisory Committee. For those of you that aren't aware what that group is, it's a high-level steering group. There's representatives across the kind of built environment, and I'm on the committee representing the builder's kind of developer side of the business. And we provide advice and information to the BSR on new emerging issues across the built environment. And we are also expected to provide leadership across the industry to drive the necessary change that we all need to work towards. So my role at Hill, in terms of the journey we've been on, I've led our sort of progression to embed the new Building Safety Act within our processes. We achieved a Building a Safer Future Charter Champion status last year. We were one of the first 8 organisations to do that, which was quite tough. We had 100 areas audited externally by ex-HSE staff, actually. So it was a tough one, and that proved that I think we're a competent builder that's got the right kind of core values. Also developed and rolled out a guidance document within the organisation, which enabled staff to start being trained from September 2023. That was a challenge, given the very late publication of the secondary legislation in August, and even more of a challenge when government decided to issue some revised definitions of what an HRB actually is, and that was on the 19th of October. After the training had already been delivered. But, you know, that's the world we live in. We've adopted a change control process within the organisation, and that was actually adopted and rolled out in 2022 because we wanted to make sure it was embedded in our culture and working practices. We're helped in that, I think, because we use a common data environment platform for all of our design and supporting documentation. So we have one version of the truth on a single platform, and that I think is something that certainly from a golden thread point of view and general kind of Building Safety Act kind of requirements, we should all be looking at having one version of the truth. Avoid having printed documentation that's out of date as soon as it's printed. We've developed a mandatory occurrence reporting process as is now required, and we were one of the first 5 organisations to make an application for an HRB under the new regime at Gateway 2. We haven't yet gone through the full process, but we've now got experience of pulling that together. So the challenges I think we face as an industry, all of us, we're in a world where there is substantial regulatory change continuing, and even as we speak, approved document B is yet to be published, the amended version. We've got BS 9991, which is sitting in the wings to be published at some stage. And, without those documents, we are trying to do our best, but not always going to succeed if we have a shifting sands kind of situation. I think we all have to recognize as well that we're in an untried and tested regime. The new regime that has been introduced is very far reaching. Now, none of us have got experience in this, including the regulator. Bearing in mind that experience is one of the cornerstones of competence. It questions how competent any of us are in the new world, but we won't go into that. But I think we do have to accept the fact that things are likely to evolve over time. Things are not likely to be right from the get-go. And I think the regulator has recognised that there's likely to be some tweaks along the way as they become more experienced as well. And these things will evolve. Now, the Hill business, part of our business, we are a contractor, design and build contractor. Part of our business, we are a self-developer. So actually, depending on which side of the business we're on, we can fulfill the role of client, principal designer, principal contractor, and the accountable person, all within one organisation, or a combination of the above. Now, people have often muted, is the new regime the death of design and build? Well, actually, I think it's probably going to be the making of design and build, because there are significant advantages having the principal designer and principal contractor under one umbrella. There's an inherently high level of coordination and liaison between those two key duty holders. First of all, the early procurement of specialist subcontractors or suppliers that are providing design is also a key plus, because we can bring to the party immediately specialist designers that are important to ensure that when we submit at Gateway 2, it's a fully holistic developed design to satisfy all of the functional requirements of the building regulations, and that's all the parts. There's a seamless integration between the design consultants, the specialist suppliers and consultants, and we can introduce our preferred buildability, program, cost efficiencies into the design solutions from the start, and therefore avoiding the potential for change control at a later date, which clearly has got time and cost implications, given that the multidisciplinary team that will be working on behalf of the regulator, this is all a kind of cost neutral for them process. So there's a price ticket attached to any involvement with the multidisciplinary team through change control. One thing the regulator has confirmed at a recent BAC meeting, Building Advisory Committee meeting, is that they expect the level of detail on the information that is submitted at Gateway 2 to include named materials for all of the key elements. They will not accept just a specification, performance specification for things like fire doors and other components. So again, having a design and build contractor in there with the knowledge to be able to pick products that they actually want to run with during construction is going to be very helpful to get that design finished. We've got clear integration when you look at the prescribed documents that are required for the Gateway 2 application. You've got a building regs compliance statement, which is one of the key documents which the principal designer will lead on. But there's also a construction control plan, which the principal contractor really is probably the lead role on that, and they have to come together. Change control applies to both parties, so having a common organization that has a common change control process is good, as does the mandatory occurrence reporting process. So, having that common process across both principal designer, principal contractor is a good thing. And then clearly partial occupation strategies could impact on both design and construction. For my two penneth, I think the choice of the titles, principal designer, principal contractor, were wrong. And we're already seeing significant confusion with our clients where they are confusing the role of the CDM, principal designer, principal contractor, with the role under the new regime. But that's just my personal view. I think it could have been clearer, I think, if there had been a different designation. And that's me. Thank you very much.
Great. Well, thanks very much indeed, Andy. That was really interesting. It begs lots of questions, but I think I'm going to wait until all the presentations are over before we tackle those. So I'd like to hand over now to Natalia from Premier Guarantee, who can talk about the challenges from the building controls perspective. So over to you, Natalia. I think you're on mute. Natalia, can you hear me? You can, yeah. Yeah, we can't hear you. You're on mute. I do apologise. We've got a technical issue here, so you could just bear with us for a few minutes. I think we might.
I would suggest disconnecting and reconnecting. In the meantime, maybe Thomas, you can take a couple of questions.
Yeah, I'll take. What I'm going to do actually, while Natalia's sorting out her connection, I'd like to sort of maybe raise the issue of the design and build contract and the role of principal contractor and principal designer. But bring in Paul on this one as well, because obviously he's got got the perspective from the principal designer. So Andy, you said that people have said that the new regime could potentially spell the death of the design and build contractor. And I mean, you went on to say that because you're a sort of fully integrated house builder, designer, and contractor, that doesn't really apply to you, and in fact is an advantage. But for those who are not, who is like, if you've got a concept architect who then maybe hands over to a designer build contractor, how is that going to work, and what are the potential challenges? And that's probably one for you, Paul. Actually, how do you see that working? Can it work, in fact?
I think there's always a challenge when you have just in terms of maintaining continuity through a project where you have a different design team that perhaps works a project up to planning. I think the planning has always been seen as the significant gateway in a project. That's the big one to tick off the list, and then it becomes a live project and a live a real possibility once you've got through that gateway. And I think we're now going to see, particularly on HRB projects, the technical side is now going to become much more significant as well. And I think it's quite right that should be the case. And I think there will need to be an increased focus on how those designs are managed all the way through. And obviously that's where the golden thread comes into it. And in terms of if there are projects where there is a different team that's developed an initial concept design and then that's handed over to a technical delivery team, this has to be very, very clear in terms of how that's handed over and the baton is taken up by the new designer. So I think it's as Andy has said, it's a brave new world for everyone, but I think it needs to be much more rigorous in terms of the documentation and how the designs are picked up and developed throughout their life cycle.
Great, thank you. Natalia, I don't know if you've got any further of your connection. Celine, who's in the background, do you any suggestions at all?
Yeah, I'll deal with Natalia. Thank you.
Okay.
Let's just go on with the questions.
I could just pick up on a quick point that Andy raised, where he talked about the potential confusion with the duty holder titles remaining the same as CDM. I think I would share that view as well. That I think the intention of the Hackett review was to avoid unnecessary confusion, and I think it's actually, from some of the conversations I've been having, it's potentially had the opposite effect, where people are they're different duty holders conceived under different legislation, and I think the government's intention was that there wouldn't be this duplication, and the same principal designer and the same principal contractor would be fulfilling both CDM and building regulations. But it remains to be seen if that's going to be the case.
Okay. Sorry, Natalia, I think you're, yes, I can see a kind of
I
green.
think I'm good.
So great. Well, let's, without further ado, Natalia, it's over to you. And we'll carry on the conversation once you've finished. Thank you.
Apologies, everyone, for having that technical error. It always happens. I'm Natalia. I'm the manager at Premier Guarantee Building Control Department, and I'm just going to give you a bit of an overview of how the new regime and how the regulation updates are affecting our industry, and specifically building control. I'm just going to give you a quick overview of some key new requirements that have come in that I think we should all be aware of. I'm going to go into a bit about how it's affecting us in building control, and specifically kind of looking at competency. And then I'm going to touch upon the new requirements we have as new RBCAs, or registered building control approvers, which were kind of your AI functions, and then just finish with how we feel that's kind of impacting the industry. Kind of going last has its benefits, doesn't it? As my colleagues on the panel have kind of been able to touch upon some of these subjects previously. I'll give you a bit of a rundown, but I will also share a link on LinkedIn later, which has a great video which goes into a bit more detail than I could probably manage in this small section on the new key requirements that my colleague has put together for us. But just to highlight some key things that we probably should be aware of. There's new legislation that came in which talks about start and commencement dates. That's something that kind of is quite intrinsic to put in new applications in with building control, and it's become quite kind of an important aspect of it. We need to know when work starts, and we need to know when work commences, which have slightly different definitions. Specifically commencements, we need to be aware of kind of the different commencement requirements for different project types. So that's something that we need to be kind of, au fait with. And that has a consequence to automatic lapse in applications. So previously, applications would trigger after 3 years, and then we would kind of start a process off to kind of to close those projects down, or to kind of revisit them. Now it's kind of an automatic lapse. So it's just some dates that we need to kind of be familiar with. Alongside that kind of supports transitional arrangements. When we look at kind of new regulations that are introduced, it kind of stops old regulations sort of being dragged out by, the previous way things were dealt with, when you'd kind of dig a hole in the ground, and that would be it. You would lock in regulations for years upon years. So when we look at kind of new introductions into Part L, for example, this new kind of start and commencement and lapse detail will kind of have quite an effect on that. I won't go too much into duty holders, because I think my colleagues have already covered that quite well today, but I will talk about competency from a building control perspective, because that's what I know about. Obviously, with the new regime in April, we are going to the oversight of HRBs will move over to the BSR. So it's something that kind of us in the private sector of building control will have less involvement with. Obviously, we'll still have involvements that kind of hit the transitional provisions and that we're still overseeing, but the majority now will sit with the BSR. There have been some updates with regards to fire safety information. Again, that's something that you should be aware of and probably look into if that's the type of work you deal with. But again, we've got the video that I'll share later on LinkedIn, which kind of goes into a bit more detail about what you need to know for that. So just moving on from there, I'll start to talk a little bit about how competency is going in building control. Oops, sorry, skipped ahead a bit. Okay, so as Jed described to us, the BSR are now kind of overseeing building control, and they introduced what we know in the industry as BICOF, which is the Building Inspector Competency Framework, and that sets out kind of 9 different key areas that we need to demonstrate our competency in. 3 different bodies came forward and put together different avenues for us to demonstrate our competency, and that was the CABE, the BSCF, which is the Building Safety Competence Foundation, and the BCCA as well. So they gave us kind of a different pathway that we could choose to demonstrate our competency. And once we have that demonstrated, we register with the BSR and we can become a registered building control inspector, which is what we need to be. The competency journey that we've been on so far hasn't been that that easy for us, I don't think. Obviously, I'm just talking from my own personal perspective, but I think I probably echo some of the sentiments within the industry. If we kind of look at how that's been so far, it was only in July 2023 that we had 2 schemes approved that we knew would be able to kind of support us in demonstrating competency, and that was CABE and the BSCF. In later in the summer, we had the introduction of the transitional regs, and the 3rd final scheme was approved, the BCCA. So that's taken us up to September. Okay, and kind of this timeline is quite helpful to kind of give you an idea of the kind of pressure that building control as an industry has been under. So by September, we have all 3 bodies approved, and we're starting as companies to decipher what the requirements are for each one and how we're going to push that forwards within our companies, and kind of how we're going to support our surveyors in understanding what they need to kind of meet these requirements. In October, the new regime kind of started for duty holders, for commencements and HRBs. So along with that, we had to kind of prepare ourselves from a company perspective, understanding the procedures that we needed to put in place in readiness for that, and obviously communicate that to our clients as well. Moving on to November and December 2023. So we're only talking about a few months ago, did the BCCA and CABE begin carrying out the interviews to demonstrate competency? So we're only talking a couple of months ago where we have a huge opportunity to kind of be able to actually go through the process and start getting registration. By April the 6th, the intention was to make sure that everyone was registered and prepared. But obviously, kind of when you kind of look at that timeline of dates, you can see that the window we've had to actually turn this round has been very small. If you look at kind of the requirements that these bodies are needing so that we can demonstrate competency, it's not an easy process, and it can't be, because we're demonstrating how competent we are to do the jobs we're doing, and they're very complex in nature. So for example, the BCCA and CABE are very in-depth portfolios that we have to produce, and it's a lot of work. And you've got to remember that kind of we're doing this alongside our normal day-to-day work, and we're doing this kind of, you know, with people's own kind of lives as well. So, you know, you have like Christmas in between all this and Easter coming up and things like that. So kind of the time that the guys have had to kind of get on with this process has been very small. But still, we kind of, you know, we're fully behind the need to demonstrate competency. It's quite funny, really, when you think about that we're an industry that are specifically regulating buildings and kind of, you know, ensuring that kind of regulations and compliance met. There was kind of little to no regulation with regards to our own competency and what we needed to do that. And the industry as a whole, the profession, was kind of very under-regulated. So we we appreciate the need for this, and I think kind of we all agree that this was needed. I think the struggle is kind of that the timeline we've had to kind of put all our surveyors through. When you're talking about a team of about 70 plus surveyors, it's a lot of work they have to undertake, and we have to undertake as a company, alongside understanding all the new regulations that are being introduced and procedures. So that kind of is a bit more specific then on the individuals themselves. But as a company, we also have to ensure that we're going to be registered with the BSR, and we're going to be able to kind of carry on working on your projects kind of post April under the new regime. So that has taken quite a lot of input and time and resource to make sure that we've got the correct processes and procedures in place. Looking at kind of how we carry out restricted functions and activities, which requires our surveyors to be registered. We have to kind of link that back to kind of supervision policies and how we go forwards allocating work to make sure the right kind of work is covered by the right person with the right class. So there's kind of a lot of background work that's going alongside this, and it's a lot to do in a very, very short space of time. We're also having kind of to update a lot of our processes and procedures. Kind of I touched upon commencement dates and start dates, and that's something that we need to have a process for. We need to have a way of recording. So kind of alongside the requirements that the RBIs, the registered building inspectors, have, as companies, we also have to kind of put in a lot of legwork to make sure that we're ready for the new regime come April. If we look at kind of how that's impacting on the industry, it was interesting that kind of one of the main questions was about kind of resource and how many people had registered with the BSR. And I think kind of although there aren't any figures that we can kind of really rely on, it is expected, and it is seen already that there's quite a big decline in the number of kind of people doing the wanting to be building control inspectors or kind of doing the role now, and that's a decline from having to go through this competency process. But alongside that, it's also about kind of the way our jobs or our roles are going to be under the new regime has almost changed slightly the role itself. And it's not necessarily how, when you start off in building control, that there was always the fine line between kind of the design advice you give and how you support your clients going forwards. Under kind of the new regime, there's a lot more onus on the clients to be able to demonstrate competency, and that's sort of, and we have to very much sidestep from that. So it's very much changing how the role will be delivered in the future, which I think is kind of, I don't want to say putting people off, but maybe a little bit. Obviously, the cost implications for the industry are going to be huge. We're talking about a small pool of people that are going to be competent at the right levels, especially when we talk about HRB work and that sort of thing. So kind of the cost for resource for that type of role, we're already seeing that, the salaries rising. And obviously that cost has to then be put forwards to clients. One thing that's been talked about a lot, especially on social media around the competency requirements for building control, is the impact on mental health. I think kind of in the last couple of months, we've seen kind of quite a detrimental effect it's had on surveyors' mental health. I mean, you could have been working in this industry 30, 40 plus years, and you're now having to demonstrate that you can do what you've been doing. And not everyone is confident in kind of doing written reports or portfolios and then having to do interviews, that sort of thing. So it is kind of having a profound effect on mental health as well. I'll leave with one final thought, and that's on kind of how is it going to impact the industry and specifically the safety of buildings? What do we think about that? Is it going to improve the safety of buildings going forwards, or kind of are we at a stalemate there? So that's me done.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Natalia. I'm really glad you finally managed to get online. Really interesting. We don't have very little time left for questions, I'm afraid, because of the we've already answered quite a few, I think, as we've gone along. But I mean, Natalia, I'm interested. I mean, obviously, there's been a lot said about maybe the building control inspectors who are closest to retirement, thinking, I can't be done with this. I'll just take over.
Yeah.
Is that your experience at Premier
Oh,
Guarantee?
yeah, very much so. Not so much within Premier Guarantee, but I know kind of from, I was previously department manager for Herefordshire Council Building Control, and I know a number of surveyors retired specifically because of the competency requirements. So it's very evident.
I mean, presumably those people are experienced. I mean, they may not be, they have that completed. Well, they're obviously not going to complete the formal competence requirements, but they obviously had years of experience. I mean, is it a concern that sort of skill set is going to disappear? It's
a huge concern. Yeah, very much so. I remember kind of as a trainee myself, I was trained by a guy who was in his 80s. So kind of because it's always been such a lovely job to have. That kind of it is a job that you can do further into your career, and so I think we're going to see a sharp decline on people who kind of who won't kind of go into it part time and kind of I think a lot will be pushed into retirement early.
And I mean, Andy, from the developer perspective, I mean, are you concerned that it's going to be harder to, it's going to slow your projects down if you can't find someone's to perform the building control function? And are you concerned about costs going up as a result?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, on HRB schemes, that would be for the regulator to find a suitable building control professional to work in the multidisciplinary team. On the non-HRB schemes, I mean, anecdotally, we're aware of smaller practices that are, I don't know what the cost is involved in going through the registration process, but that could be an impact on smaller businesses. I think as an industry, we're already aware before this came in that experienced building control professionals in the HRB world were a bit thin on the ground, and taking away the more experienced people can only be a bad thing if that actually manifests itself, if that's what we're seeing, because there's some parts of the country that are very thin on the ground with experienced building control professionals, particularly on the more complex schemes. Those boots can't be filled immediately. It takes a lot of time to actually develop the experience that you need to be able to jump into these larger schemes. You can't just move from being a trainee 1 minute and having a couple of years experience to being expected to determine whether something meets the functional requirements of the building regs on a really complex scheme. That takes time in the game.
Sure. And I mean, and Gerard, from the point of view of the building safety regulator, is it a concern about the pool of expertise needed, particularly for these more complex, high-risk projects?
Well, absolutely. I mean, like most professions, building control as a profession struggles to recruit. There's a shortage of most professions, not just building control. The government's invested in new trainees into the profession. It invested in the BCSF competence assessment scheme, which I took my class 3 test 2 years ago. So it's been there, it's been available, certainly for local authorities. So it is a massive challenge for industry, absolutely, and I completely recognise that.
And given that we've got about a minute left, is there one final question for everybody? Are you all confident that, I mean, obviously this is a big change for the industry, there's going to be a lot of challenges. Are you all confident that in the long term, it'll sort of even itself out and we'll get a safer built environment as a result?
Well, I am absolutely confident. What I've seen coming through is absolutely fantastic. It obviously we've got concerns, but it's a great opportunity for building inspectors to be part of a regulated profession. to be recognised for the work that they do in local authorities and in the private sector, which is absolutely invaluable to the construction world and the building standards and the environment that we all live and work in. I think it's a great opportunity. I think I appreciate the challenges. I can see the challenges, and I absolutely appreciate that. But it is also, as well, a great opportunity for those working in the building control profession.
Great. Well, thanks very much. Anyone else like to come in quickly on that point?
I'll just say quickly, from my perspective as a designer, I think there's a certain school of thought that designers and architects who are already working as lead designers are already likely to be carrying out these duties, and the legislation is really more about the processes and the coordination of design and how those processes are demonstrated in terms of being more rigorous with record keeping and keeping obviously we've talked about the golden thread, but I think it's more about, I do have confidence that there'll be more of a process that people will have, there'll be a higher bar that people will have to achieve, I think, and it's obviously early days, but I think we'll see improvements.
From my point of view, I think it's early days, and I think this will evolve through time as new processes tend to. But ensuring that we actually construct what was designed, and we eliminate product substitution and changes on the hoof that are not controlled, and actually starting from a complete set of coherent sort of drawings and design can only be a good thing. Moving away from the old build design kind of practices that did exist in the industry. So having a strong change control golden thread regime can only be good. So we have confidence that what's on the piece of paper, a virtual piece of paper, represents what's actually being constructed.
Great, thank you. Tanya, any final comments before we finish?
Yeah, I feel fully confident that given a couple of years, this will work itself out. At the moment, we're just fully in the thick of it, but I think everything that is there for a reason. We fully embrace the competency requirements. We understand why we're there and why it's needed. And yeah, I think the future looks bright. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Well, I mean, that's a really positive note on which to end. That all this sort of short-term pain is worth it for the long-term gain.
Yeah.
I'd like to say thanks very much to everybody for listening, and I'm sorry that we couldn't answer all your questions. It's obviously a complex topic, and I know a lot of you are putting forward queries to be answered. I believe this webinar will be available on demand. And one final point is we do rely on your feedback so we can improve webinars in the future. So we'd appreciate it if you could take the short survey that will pop up on your screen after this webinar finishes. So in the meantime, I'd like to say good afternoon to everybody and thanks to our speakers. Goodbye.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.